Hi everyone, I'm Nessreen, I'm from Intel Labs, and I'm going to talk today about fast Graphlet decomposition, theory algorithms, and applications. So this is joint work with Ted Wilkie from Intel Labs, who was supposed to also be here today, and unfortunately he couldn't make it because he had an emergency. Jen Neville from Purdue University, Nick Duffield, who's also here today, and Ryan Rossi from Xerox PARC. So that talk basically is more concerned with some techniques around the area of graph mining. So just to give you a brief, definitely everyone talks about graphs, and graphs are a very good, rich data representation and allows us to study phenomena from a variety of domains, such as social networks, biological, or even computer networks or the web. And so today we are going to talk about one of the fundamental subgraphs that are concerned here, which is called graphlets. So what's graphlets? So graphlets basically are those small k-vertex induced subgraphs. So what we are caring about here is basically those smaller subgraph patterns that exist in the graph. And so if you have a very large graph, then how can you find those small subgraph patterns in order to understand your network better and your data better? So the smallest idea of graphlet could be basically to think about an edge, which is like just two connected nodes, or disconnected if they are just completely don't have any link in between them. But overall, the general concept generalized to any k-vertex, which means you have k nodes inside the subgraph itself. So it could be 3 like triangles or wedges, or it could be 4 or 5 or whatever any size that you're more like caring about, so such as cliques or cycles or whatever. So there is another term that is usually used interchangeably with graphlets, which is motifs. So motifs are basically those particular graphlets that occur in the real-world networks with frequencies that are higher or much higher than if you are actually generating the network randomly. So that means that those are very particular graphlets that are already existing in some particular networks just due to the generative process or whatever the type of that network that's happening. And they have been used and applied in different areas like such as the food web, the genetic or neural or many other types of networks where they actually found distinct graphlets in each case that actually describe certain characteristics or distinct characteristics about these networks. So some of the pioneering work in that area is definitely by Milo et al. In 2002, where he basically found out that those motifs or graphlets could be actually the simple building blocks of complex networks and in understanding those complex networks. There is also definitely other work by Mark Newman and many other researchers were concerned with this problem. More recently, to just motivate the problem further, the graphlets themselves are very interesting in different areas also around machine learning. So for example, this is one of the highly cited papers in the area of graphlets where they basically try to use the graphlet counts as features for learning machine learning models and being able to classify different types of networks. Another example is also in bioinformatics where they found out that graphlets or the graphlet degree distribution can be used to compare different biological networks and also to do some sort of like biological network alignment among the nodes. So those are just few examples, but there are so many different applications for graphlets from biological, social networks, and even in cybersecurity or the web where it could be used also for spam detection. The fundamental question in all these types of applications that are more concerned about graphlets is basically how can you count graphlets of size k? So before you actually use graphlets, you need to actually count them. You need to be able to extract them from a very large graph. So the idea is that given a family of graphlets of size k, which is basically the full distribution of all possible subgraphs that are actually of that particular size, and you have another input graph that you're given, how can you basically count the number of appearances or embeddings of each graphlet inside the input graph? So to give you an example, which is more familiar, so you could ask a question, how many triangles, for example, in the graph, or how many cliques of size 4 nodes in the graph, or how many cycles, and so forth. In practice, we are actually concerned with counting all k-vertex graphlets, which is basically the full distribution, because if you can have that method that can nicely jointly count all possible graphlets, it will allow you to do different types of applications instead of just having to count only one of them. So just to give you some sense of what kind of solutions and how, what's the complexity in this problem. So one possible solution in this problem will be to actually enumerate all possible graphlets. So that will definitely be an exhaustive enumeration, which is extremely expensive and will increase with the size of the graph, but will also increase with the size of the graphlet itself, which is k. Now, some more clever methods say that, okay, how about counting these graphlets for each node independently, and then let's just combine all the counts from all the nodes. And so that still will grow exponentially with k, and so it's still expensive if you actually increase k. So it could be useful for counting like smaller sized graphlets, but it will probably be prohibitive for larger ones. And more recently, there have been some attempts to extend that work to counting graphlets of size k equals 4. And again, some of these methods don't have really good complexity. So to summarize, most of the previous work has been really not practical to solve this problem. And it only scales for smaller graphs with few hundred and thousand nodes or edges. It could take probably thousands of seconds just for a graph like with 20,000 nodes, which is like very small compared to the type of graphs that everyone is actually studying right now. So that in some sense limits the applicability of these, the concept of graphlets or these kinds of features that could actually allow you to gain more insights in the graph itself or the data that you have. So while most work focused on graphlets of size k, which is triangles, is one very well-known example. There is a lot of research in this. In this work, we actually try to provide a generic framework for any size of graphlets, but we focus mainly on showing how can this be used for k equals 3 and 4 nodes. And this work in particular will be, we will be talking about those two papers, which is, one of them was an ICDM last year, and the other one is a journal extension of it. To give you a sense how the approach works. So the first thing that we try to do is that we are basically providing an approach that's edge-centric, which means that you work for every particular edge independently. And so what we do is that we basically try to search the edge neighborhood, the one hop away edge neighborhood. And so we do that for every edge. We try to count certain graphlets, and then we merge the counts from all edges. So very obviously, this can be parallelized in a very easy way. Now, how can we save the computations further? So what we do is that what we found out is that if you can count only triangles, then essentially there are relationships between triangles and every other possible graphlet here. And then you can use equations to get the counts of the others in constant time. So essentially, if you count only one graphlet, then you could possibly get the other ones in constant time, and that will save a lot of the computation and get you more insights about the distribution itself. So now I'm going to talk more about how can we extend that to the larger graphlets. So since the size 3 has been well studied, but we would like to see how that could be done for larger graphlets. So the approach here, as I said, is basically edge-centric. So what we try to do is that we try to define or find certain properties for every node that's connected to the edge that we are concerned with at this point. And so once we found these particular structural properties, which basically define how the node is actually connected to the particular edge we are looking at right now, edge E, then we can basically try to prune the space, and then we can try to search for the graphlets within the space that's actually corresponding to these kinds of graphlets. So instead of having to search for a graplet in the full space of the node neighborhood or the edge neighborhood, then you can actually prune it by allowing you to define those kinds of properties or structural properties. So to give you an example here, those two vertices in particular are connected with E as an edge, so they are both forming some sort of a triangle with edge E. So they are both triangle nodes, while V1 and V4 are both like star nodes or wedge nodes. So essentially, if you want to search for certain graphlets that are more related to the triangle nodes, then you should definitely search here and not search for everything else. And that's only for the neighborhood. So how about the not neighborhood? So you could say basically that those nodes that are not connected to E are basically completely independent because they are like further hops away from the edge E. So that's essentially the main idea here. Now, how can you use this to count all 4 node graphlets? One of the major problems with graphlets is that once you increase the size K itself, the space of all possible graphlets will just exponentially increase. So the basic idea would be saying that, okay, I have 11 possible graphlets here. I'm going to run my algorithm for each possible one, and that will be extremely expensive, and you might just like probably just give up and not actually continue doing this. So what we try to do is basically try to use that hierarchical approach where we define these kinds of structural properties to prune the space and then use also some other clever approaches to save a lot of the computation. So to give you an idea here, the first step here, basically we try to search the edge neighborhood, we find the triangles, and we define these different properties over the nodes. And then in the next step, we will count only the 4 node clicks and the 4 node cycles, so those are only 2 patterns. And then in the final step, what we do is that we use combinatorial relationships and arguments that basically can allow us to obtain the rest of the 11 counts, but in constant time. So that allows you to save the computation drastically and still give you the full distribution in a nice way. Once you are done with doing this for every edge, basically you can merge the counts from all the edges. That's easy and can be done in parallel. So now the question is, how can you define these combinatorial relationships among the graphlet counts or the graphlets? So what we found out basically is that you can represent the graphlets as a model that's basically defined as a transition diagram. So you have a transition diagram here, basically where if you move from the right to the left, you are basically removing 1 edge at a time. And if you're moving from the left to the right, you are actually adding 1 edge at a time. So to give you an example, this is the 4-click. If you remove any of the edges in the 4-click, that will give you a chordal cycle. Then now, if you are dealing with the chordal cycle, you remove any of the edges, then that could be giving you multiple different graphlets, for example, the cycles. Now, if you are dealing with the cycles, you could move to another graphlet like the chain and so on and so on. So that type of model where you could move by just 1 edge addition or one removal of 1 edge clearly shows that there are pairwise relationships among the graphlets. And so if you can actually model those mathematically or have an equation that capture the relationship between those pairwise graphlets, then you will be able to, just count 1 and get the other for free. So that's basically the idea. So to give you a sense, what we do here in this algorithm is that basically we count only the clicks and the cycles. And with the relationships that I was just talking about, we obtained all the rest. And so that's how much things are actually connected and, in a relational way. And so that allows us to definitely not just reduce the computation, but the algorithm itself can be, the complexity of the algorithm will be much less than any other algorithm that's already existing. Now, I'm not going to have too much time, of course, to talk about all these combinatorial relationships, but I would like to give some sense of it. So here is an example that shows the relationship between 4 clicks and 4 chordal cycles. So as we just mentioned, we are working on an edge-centric approach, which means that we are working with a certain particular edge at a time. So if you look at this edge, and this is basically one of the 4 clicks that's incident to edge E, then you can easily say that any 4-click can be decomposed into 2 triangles that are both incident to edge E. And that's just the fundamental idea of clicks that, the bigger click can be decomposed to a smaller click of size k-1. So that's the whole idea. Now, it's very clear that for a 4-click, those 2 triangle nodes that are already connected to E has to be also connected themselves. Now, you can get a general sense of how many clicks that are there for any edge by just saying that if I count the triangles for edge E, then I can say number of triangles of edge E choose 2. That gives me some sort of generally how many triangles, how many 4 clicks could be there. But definitely you don't know exactly because that's not an exact bound. On the other hand, or in contrast, basically, if you look at the 4 chordal cycle, which is basically related to the clicks by removing one of the edges, So again, it can be decomposed into two triangles, but those two triangles are themselves not connected. So the only difference here is basically between whether those two triangles are connected or are connected in the case of the clique, or they are not connected in the case of the four chordal cycles. Now, if you want to represent this by an equation, you could say in general, over the summation over all the edges in the graph, if you have that term, the number of triangles of each was 2, and then you have the cliques, then you can obtain the chordal cycles in constant time, which is exactly what we do. So then that means, yeah, just count this one. This one will be nicely already obtained from counting triangles, and then this one will be just obtained in constant time. And that's how you could save a lot of the computation. So there are so many of these relationships that we have provided in the paper, so I'm not going to have, unfortunately, too much time for this, so I will leave it for offline discussions. But I would like to give you some sense of how these, that framework basically provide the nice results over the previous work. So our experimental setup is basically that we have a shared memory implementation using OpenMP at this point, and we tested on different graphs up to over a billion edges. And a variety of like different types of graphs, over like 300 plus, and from different types of networks and different domains. So this is a subset of the Facebook 100 networks, which is like one of the well-known benchmark approaches. And we compare here to one of the major baseline methods that try to count 4-node graphlets. And in our approach, we count both 3 and we count also 4. So we basically obtain both. So as you could see, like the baseline method takes 100 or up to thousands of seconds for these networks, while in our approach, we take only a few seconds, in some time we take even a fraction of a second. That's how fast it is. Another example, basically, for massive graphs. So we take only 45 minutes for a graph like Social Orchid, which is like over 117 million edges. While the baseline method in those cases wouldn't even be able to finish, and the method itself will crash. So those are different examples. And another thing that's also important about graphlets is that if you can count all of them, then you could basically try to understand how the graphlet counts change per the type of the network. So these are different types of networks, and if you look at the infrastructure networks in particular, for the 4-click, you'll notice that the 4-click is very underrepresented in infrastructure. So these are types of insights that you can actually gain from obtaining these distributions. Now, just briefly about the scaling results. So we were able to obtain like very strong scaling results, almost linear over a 16-core, and we are actually working on testing that for a larger number of cores. Now, I would like to take the time to actually talk a little bit about applications, since applications are very crucial when it comes to obtaining features from the graph. Like how can graphlets be useful for different applications? So this is one of the applications that is common around machine learning community, which is basically saying that you could have a collection of graphs, okay? And so you could say that those are basically protein graphs. And then each one of those graphs is having a label. So you have different labels. So in the case of protein graphs, maybe some of them will be labeled as enzymes versus non-enzymes. And so now the question is basically, what if I assume that we have only a few labeled graphs? So how can you predict the labels of the unlabeled graphs using those graphlets as features? So one of the problems with graphs is that they don't lend themselves naturally to many machine learning methods. So one way is to try to extract a feature representation from the graph itself and then use some of the machine learning methods in order to learn a model and predict the labels. So that's basically the slide tried to explain that idea where we basically have those collection of graphs. We will give them to the graphlet feature extraction, and then we will represent them in like as a feature matrix representation. So for every graph is basically be represented by a row which represent the frequency of every graphlet in that graph. Then now once you do that, you could learn a model and then predict the labels of the unlabeled ones. So now I would like to give you a sense of how, like the quality of these predictions, how it could be. So those are two different, like one of the benchmark data sets in this area where you have like two, one is like protein graphs and the other one is basically chemical compound graphs. And they are collection of graphs of over like 1,000 or 100 types of graphs. And then what we tried to do is that we extracted all those possible graphlet features up to size 4, and then we tried to learn a model basically with some support vector machine model, and then the accuracy that we were able to obtain is like basically 76 or 86%. So you could actually get a lot of insights from just using those ones. Now, what is more important here is the time that you actually take to compute these features. So the time that we take to compute these features, we were able to take like a second or even less than a second, while previous work was taking basically more than hours, or 2 hours. So that just shows how graphlets could be useful for representing some graphs. While in the future, we would like to actually to do more like beyond that work by trying to learn those feature representations. So graphlets could be some basic features that you would start with and try to learn the space of features that are possible from each graphs and in an adaptive way or an unsupervised way. Now, another example that's very common nowadays is basically how could you use graphlets to be able to visually spot outliers in the graph and gain more insights about the graph. So this is an example of some visualization of the human disease network. So you have a network of disorders or disease genes that are linked by their known associations. And what we have done here basically is that we weighted and colored the links by the number of stars of size 4. And so once we did that, we were able to automatically spot the biggest hubs or biggest stars in the graph. So for example, the colon cancer, leukemia, or deafness, those were actually the largest stars in the graph. And the concept here is actually very simple. The idea is the largest star of the graph is basically can be decomposed into smaller stars that are actually of size 4 or size 2. So that means that if you can actually use the smaller graphlets, then you can actually gain insights into the bigger graphlets as well. The other thing is that in another example, you could think about cliques. So for cliques, for example, can be decomposed into smaller cliques. And then if you can use the smaller 4 cliques, then you can actually gain insights more into the other one. So that's one example. And one of the very most important things when you deal actually with visualization is that you would like to be able to do this fast and in an interactive way. So if the algorithm itself is fast, then that will allow you to do that. And that was the case basically for these types of graphlets and algorithm. Now, some work in progress that we do. We are basically extending the framework to the local graphlet decomposition, which is slightly different. So instead of trying to count the graphlets globally for the entire graph, we are trying to basically use them as features on the node and the edge level. And so there are so many applications for this around the area of relational machine learning, role discovery, and multi-label classification, which allows you to extract structural or topological features from the graph itself. Another thing that is also very useful is basically what's called unbiased estimation or approximation methods for graphlets. So no matter how much you will try to scale your algorithm, or if the algorithm is scalable, still when you increase the size of the graph, you still, you could get more delays. And so one of the ways to actually speed up things even further for, massive graphs would be basically to try to estimate them. So what we are doing right now is that basically we are trying to build an unbiased estimation and sampling framework that can be integrated with the original graphlet framework, where you could massively or significantly reduce the size of the graph while you can still obtain an unbiased estimate that's accurate enough to give you an idea of what is going on. And that's useful because in many cases when we deal with big data, we don't care about the exact counts as much as we care about an approximate count that's actually close enough to the exact count and has some unbiased properties, basically. So those two figures basically show the estimation of counts for 4-node cliques. So here, this is for social ORCID, and that's basically the sample size. So as we increase the sample size, which is the number of edges that we will sample, and here, the y-axis is a ratio between the estimate of 4 cliques and the exact or actual value of the 4 clicks. So the red line represents the exact, and the blue circles basically represent the estimate. So as you can see, when you even reduce the sample size to even like 10,000 edges, you can still obtain a very good estimate of the 4 vertex click counts. And the variance will be definitely shrinking as you increase the sample size. So it has like nice convergence on or consistent properties as an estimator as well. And that's an example on another data set, which is a social Flickr data set. In summary, I have basically was trying to present to you a newer framework and a number of algorithms that try to obtain like graphlet counts. And this is one of the very first parallel approaches that actually out there in the literature. We were able to obtain over a 460x actually speed up over the current methods. Our approach has like some nice load balancing properties in terms of parallelism. So it is an edge-centric computation and allows us to only look at the edge neighborhood and not go further. One of the also nice properties about this approach is that because we reduce the computation, so it is very space efficient and time efficient as well. We are basically developing some sampling and estimation approaches that can be integrated with the original exact approach, and it can be used also for local and global counting, and has like a lot of different applications around the area of graph mining and machine learning. Both the code and the data are both available online, so email us if you have any questions, and then finally, thank you.